When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Morning decisions. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
Hear that? That's now Crispy and McCrispy strips meeting Creamy Caesar sauce. Sounds extra crispy. Caesar sauce at McDonald's for a limited time. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Pericles, if he wishes to promote a particular policy or oppose another one, has either to speak himself in public to 6,000 plus in the open air at all seasons, in all weathers, except when it's pouring with rain. Then the rain stopped play. Pericles had therefore to be a superb orator, and a contemporary source, one that's not normally favourable to him, a comic poet, said that persuasion sat on his lips, which is a lovely expression. He was super rhetorically proficient, but he's constantly at risk. In other words, if somebody takes against him or if a policy he proposes goes wrong, he's for the chop.
Drink? Now, shall we begin? Hello. Pericles was the foremost statesman of Athens' classical age in the 5th century BC, dominating the political sphere and giving his name to the building programme that produced the architecture we see on the Acropolis today. But what was he really like, beyond the orator and politician? Paul Cartledge, A.G. Leventis Professor of Greek Culture at the University of Cambridge, honorary citizen of modern-day Sparta, and author of a new biography of Pericles, joins to discuss the great man. We talk about Pericles' midlife crisis, his genius for giving speeches and manipulating the electorate, and we start with Paul's experience on the BBC radio programme In Our Time, on which Paul has often appeared as a guest. Plenty more history is on the way, including an Alexander the Great special, but let's head into the club with Paul Cartledge.
I love that voice.
Paul, thanks so much for joining me. You need no introduction. Thanks for giving me your time.
Absolutely my pleasure, Ollie. Thank you.
Well, Paul, this is, you're fresh from a recent recording of In Our Time. And so my first question to you, because I think the episode was on the Delian League.
Yes.
With the new host.
Yes.
And you were on with Melvyn Bragg many, many times. I wondered, how is our new presenter of In Our Time?
It's a nice question. I did 22 with Melvyn. And this was my first with Misha Glenny. And there is a difference. They're both, of course, super smart and extremely well educated and historically minded. Misha's much, much softer. And I'm not saying he's a soft touch. He knew when to intervene. Melvyn could be quite harsh. And as he got older, he was a little bit less temperate, shall we say, than he had been. But he also wished to steer the conversation rather more. Misha was much more reactive, and Melvyn tended to be a little more proactive. But what was to me most impressive was the two younger members. I'm ancient. The two younger guests. One was a PhD student of mine, Polly Lowe. The other one had had her Oxford DPhil thesis examined by Polly. That's Leah Lazar. And they absolutely were made to feel completely comfortable, and it was their first show ever. So it was my 23rd and their first. So it's a great experience.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Polly has actually been on this podcast. So good training for her, I suspect.
She's got taste as well as brains.
Indeed, indeed. So, and I did note, we won't linger on this too long, but the reading list included the new translation by Robin Waterfield, which Polly's helped out with.
Well,
Is
Polly
that
was the introducer and the annotator. I've done that for other people. It's a very useful exercise. I actually did it for Tom Holland, where we did a Herodotus together. And Polly was a little less interventionist, I think, than I was. But what it does is it sets the scene, and then the actual translation is of those that are both attempting to be accurate and literate. It's the best. So you've got some that are more literate, that is more aimed to be excellent examples of English prose, and you've got others. And actually, I'm an academic, so I go the other direction. There is one by Jeremy Minot for CUP, Cambridge Press, which is actually very craggy. It doesn't read well, but then Thucydides' Greek was not elegant. It was not Platonic. It was not flowing like Herodotus is. So if you're trying to reproduce that, then I actually prefer Jeremy's to Robin's. But I have been pushing Robin's, and it was shortlisted recently for a prize called the International Hellenic Prize, which I am a judge of. The result's not out, so I won't say any more.
Ooh, that's interesting. I must send a note of congratulations to Robin because I greatly enjoyed chatting with him.
Oh,
Um,
excellent. Yes, no, he's super. I worked with him on Xenophon.
Wonderful. Right. Well, we're not here to talk about other people's work, or we're here to talk about your new book, which is a biography of Pericles, the great Athenian. Well, your subtitles are statesman, demagogue, and eccentric, which is a part of, I think, a series that you're editing, and always wonderful to see. I think two current series on the go. James Rom has his own series, but this one with Pericles must be the lead title. This is an extraordinary figure, Pericles, and so much so that I think a significant chunk of classical Athens is named after him. And so, I mean, is Pericles someone that you've always wanted to write a biography of? Because it's quite seldom you actually get biographies of these books, other than these new series we see.
Well, the reason for wanting to tackle him is that he is so central. And one of the things you said is actually one of my motivations. We hear about the age of Pericles. Now, okay, he was a major, major figure, but he was just one figure, if you like, in one city. Now, okay, Athens was a very important city, but Athens was not Greece. And I've actually read Periclean Greece. People use that adjective, and I think it's incorrect because you can only extend your influence so far. And what I immediately think of, there is a book by Voltaire on Louis XIV, and it's called Le siècle de Louis XIV, Louis XIV. And siècle in French means both century and age, saeculum in Latin. And so the point there is that Louis was an autocrat. He was an absolute monarch. What he said went. L'État, c'est moi. Well, l'État, that is the Athenian democratic state, was not Pericles. So there was no such thing as Greece to begin with. There was no such thing politically. And there were lots and lots of Greek cities. There were 1,000 of them. So, okay, Athens is a very big deal, along with Sparta, and then you can add in maybe Syracuse. They are really the most important. But so that was one of my motivations. Another was not exactly to rival or take on Plutarch, but there is only one serious ancient biography of him, and that's by Plutarch. Now, there's a very odd thing about Plutarch. He compares Pericles. You'd think, well, now who would be an equivalent, not royal, but republican and very powerful statesman or political figure, leading figure, and so on? You could think of quite a few, I think. But what Plutarch was forced back on was Quintus Fabius Maximus. He wrote parallel biographies. So what was it about Quintus, that is a Roman general famous for delaying tactics against Hannibal, not for actually beating him, because that was done by another general. Scipio Africanus. So what was it about Pericles that reminded Plutarch of Quintus Fabius Maximus and vice versa? Their caution. Well, true. Pericles famously said, don't go too far, very Greek, nostrum, don't seek to add to your possessions, he told the Athenians. Don't exaggerate your interventions, blah, blah, blah. Hang on to what you've got. But that was just in one particular circumstance. We're in the 430s BC. Perhaps for your listeners, I should say, Pericles was born about 495. We don't know when precisely. Born to the purple, that is, he had a very distinguished ancestry. On his mother's side, he was descended from somebody called Cleisthenes, who was the supposed founder of the democracy. He had a very elaborate and very illustrious career, but he nevertheless was not in quite the same situation as I've said already, Louis XIV. So he lived to 429. He lived there for about 65 years, and he had this extraordinary career. So I wanted to try to put him both in context and to, as it were, cut him down to size, because the contemporary source that really thought Pericles was, and this is the ultimate source of why we think Pericles was the greatest, was Thucydides. Thucydides, an Athenian, a contemporary, like Pericles, a leading figure in the democracy. He was elected general and so on. But unlike Pericles, Thucydides was not a democrat. Thucydides did not think it was a good thing that the demos, the mass of the Athenian people, had the kratos. Demokratia is power of the mass of the people. And he, Thucydides, was both an aristocrat, like Pericles, by birth, but he was an aristocrat of the mind. He was a kind of oligarch. And Pericles was not. Pericles was from very early, when we first hear about him on the political stage, that's when he's just in his early 20s, he's already pro-democratic, and that was the thread throughout his career.
Does that mean the democracy is, and you're his biographer, so you should know, but in his soul, or is it the fact that he can, how shall I put this? Well, manipulate the population, and so therefore he's a Democrat?
Yes, now why I put two political terms in the subtitle, which you quoted, statesman, demagogue, was precisely that. So if you read Thucydides, he is what you and I would call a statesman, as opposed to a mere politician. We today, we live in a kind of democracy, very, very different. We live in a representative democracy. We choose other people to rule for us, but also to rule over us. We don't rule ourselves. The Athenians did. Thucydides thought that the great thing about Pericles, unlike other leading politicians whom he didn't like democracy, he therefore didn't like the way in which the Athenians did politics. The great thing about Pericles, according to Thucydides, was he led the people instead of trying to follow the lowest, the basest wishes and whims, the foibles of ordinary people. So you can get what I'm getting at, which is populism. Thucydides was anti-populism, and Pericles was not, in his view, what you and I would call a populist. The ancient Greek word for a populist was demagogos, which means leader of the people, but leader in such a way as to mislead them in your opinion. You think a demagogue gets things wrong. He doesn't give the right advice for the people that's best for them. He gives the advice, or he makes the promises which the masses wish to have fulfilled, but actually can't be. You can see where I'm coming from in terms of today's politics. So the original meaning of demagogos was simply leader of the demos. It's neutral. In order to lead in a society without technology, you and I are speaking via Zoom. I'm not in the same room with you. I can see your features and everything like that, but I can't really interact with you. There's no common space. In Athenian politics, everything is upfront and personal, in your face as well as face to face. So Pericles was as good, if you like, as his last speech or the last policy that he favored, which someone else, a friend of his, spoke up for. So every month, the Athenian masses, the 6,000 plus, meet on a hill in the open air underneath the Acropolis. It's called the Pnyx because everybody's squeezed together there. And they are presented with an agenda drawn up for them by the council. Council is chosen by lot, and the Athenians thought the lot was the way to choose officials, with just two exceptions: generals, admirals, and top financial officials. So Pericles, if he wishes to promote a particular policy or oppose another one, has either to speak himself in public to 6,000 plus in the open air at all seasons, in all weathers, except when it's pouring with rain. Then the rain stopped play. Pericles had therefore to be a superb orator, and a contemporary source, one that's not normally favorable to him, a comic poet, said that persuasion sat on his lips, which is a lovely expression. He was super rhetorically proficient, but he's constantly at risk. In other words, if somebody takes against him or if a policy he proposes goes wrong, he's for the chop. He will be either prosecuted or he will not be re-elected. And elections are every year, not every 5 years, as we have in our so-called democracy.
I wonder, presumably, he was that good. Would there be little tricks that are difficult to discern from the sources, in that you mentioned that everyone's crammed in the Pnyx? Would it be he would recognise voters, or he would pick people out in the crowd, and little tricks like that to manipulate or to persuade, rather?
No, you're quite right. Persuasion is the word. Pytho in Greek was actually a goddess, and the Athenians literally worshipped in abstract form the notion of persuasiveness. But we have not a single speech of his in his own words for sure. We have versions of what he said, and we have to take it on trust that he actually did give the speech. But that's the problem we ancient historians have. There's no way of, as it were, going to the archives and checking as we can with Churchill. But there is a famous kind of speech at Athens, which is very, very democratic, because it's a speech in which you're supposed not just to talk about the immediate issue, which, by the way, is the deaths of many of your fellow countrymen in battle. So it's a funeral speech. You're chosen by the council to deliver it. And Pericles was chosen more than once. And on one occasion, very famously, Thucydides thought the speech he gave was so important that it made a difference, that it both represented what Pericles stood for, where Athens stood when he delivered it, and how Athens should have been. But sadly, this is Thucydides, Athens didn't live up to the high ideals of Pericles in the funeral speech of 431, 430. So just to give you one phrase from that, you asked what might his particular qualities have been, other than, in other words, the sound of his voice, the modulation, the way in which he used body language. I mean, we do know a little bit about that because one of his successors, that is a man called Cleon, is said to have thrown his hands around on the podium and been very sort of undisciplined, whereas that implies that Pericles was rather austere, that just stood and delivered, and therefore his voice alone, not his hands, not anything like that. Well, one of the phrases that lives forever, because if you go on the web, you'll find famous statements or famous utterances by Pericles. Well, one of them is that he said Athens, his Athens, democratic Athens, was an education, a paideusis, for all Hellas. So he's making the point here, Athens somehow stands for Greece. We are not just Athenians, though we're terribly proud to be Athenians. We'd rather be that than anything else, but we're embodying a notion of Greekness. And other Greeks ought to see how we do things, by which he means democratically, and then they will live better, they will have better values. And he's specifically contrasting the way the Athenians bring up their children, aspire to communal values, not individual, and for the collective good, but in an unforced, undisciplined, in the sense of not tyrannically imposed way of life. Sparta, on the other hand, he says, well, that's just like a military society where people are forced to live in the way that the Spartans think you should live. And anyway, we don't think that's a good way to live. They spend much too much of their time on war, whereas we are interested in the arts, the things, the good things of life. And he means things like, we mean also theatre, which was absolutely one of Athens' glories, and still today, Athenian tragedies, comedies of the 5th century BC, of Pericles' time, survive. Why? Because they're uniquely good.
They certainly are. They certainly are. Well, the other third word in your subtitle is eccentric. And I was reading the book, and the when he's in his mid-40s, I think, mid to late 40s, he divorces his wife, and they have two kids.
Had divorced already. He was divorced by his mid-40s. He is divorced. We don't know exactly, right, but he's a single man, yes.
Okay. And then he hooks up with this presumably very attractive, although we don't have much evidence, very attractive sort of 20, 21-year-old. Is this a kind of the equivalent of buying a Ferrari and basically a midlife crisis?
It's eye candy. Well, I think, yes, you can apply that on a purely individual emotional level. Why that particular woman? Well, it had to be someone, didn't it? Given what we know of Pericles, exceptionally, if you're going to choose someone, in other words, rather than marry for status and according to convention, which is what he did with his wife, and probably his only wife, the one who was the mother of his two legitimate children. We don't know her name, which is a very, very revealing fact about that woman. I mean, I find it utterly extraordinary that we don't know the name of Pericles' wife. And so mid-40s.
And sorry to interrupt you.
No, go on.
That's quite unusual amongst other elite statesmen at the period?
Absolutely. It's a given almost, because it very much matters. If you're from an aristocratic family and you're producing children who have to carry on the name, well, somehow the identity of your mother can be as important as the identity of your father. There are exceptions. I'm not saying that this is a unique case, but it's very much extraordinary. It's not normal that we don't know Pericles' wife's name. So Miletus, which is a city now, it would be in Western Turkey, had relations with, that is, relations of probably economics, but also politics with Athens for quite some time. It's what would be an equivalent today. I sometimes think Britain, Portugal, allegedly our oldest alliance is with Portugal. So there's some sort of emotional bond. At any rate, Miletus was an ally of Athens. Therefore, it's not that he's marrying a woman from an enemy state. He's not actually marrying her either, but I'll come back to that. Miletus is somewhere from which you would expect there to be relations between elite people, that is, elite Milesians with elite Athenians. And that surely is how Pericles meets, through the father of Aspasia. He meets, her name is Aspasia or Aspasia in modern Greek, which means something like joy. So, yes, you're right, he's smitten. But, and this is the irony, a case of hoist with your own petard, in 451, when Pericles is circa 45, He proposes a measure. He actually puts his name to it. Therefore, this is something he thinks is very, very important. That from that time on, only if you have an Athenian citizen mother, as well as an Athenian citizen father, will any children, whether male or female, count as citizens and count as legitimate. And therefore, having passed that measure, we don't know what the majority was, but I think part of it was sort of nativism. In other words, everybody who is Athenian after 450 is going to be partly Athenian because their mother's Athenian as well as their dad. And there was a myth which the Athenians put out. Where did we all come from? Well, you know what? We were actually born, our original ancestor, from the soil. So you can't get more Athenian than being born. Of course, myth, it's nonsense. Nobody's born from the soil. But this was put out quite solemnly. And there is another people, they're called the Arcadians. They also thought that they were born from the soil, but most Greeks thought they were born from the normal sexual intercourse. But no, the Athenians came up, and I think it's to reinforce this actual legal status that was introduced from 450. Therefore, when Pericles hitches up with Aspasia in the early 440s, circa 449, 448, any children born of that union would be illegitimate. The Greeks had a word nothos. And if it's male, if the offspring is male, they were segregated in terms of education because there was a particular gymnasium, that is a place where young men exercise, teenagers as well as adult males, exercise in the nude, gymnos. So gymnasium comes from gymnos. Well, there was one specifically for nothoi, for bastards, i.e. they couldn't exercise in the gyms where free, legitimate citizens could. So, it's quite an extraordinary thing for one of the leading citizens of the state, having proposed and got past a measure, then to set up in such a way that by definition, any offspring couldn't be Athenian. And of course, Aspasia being a youngish woman, childbearing age, we think probably in her early 20s, would have wanted, and this is a very normal thing, and birth control was virtually non-existent, would have wanted to have a child, and they did have, but allegedly only one, and they called him Pericles, and I think I'm pretty sure why they called him that. Anybody would think, well, you're a bastard. You can't mix with the rest, but you're Pericles, so we know who your dad is. And in ancient terms, there are no birth certificates, there's no DNA. Who your father was determines who you are. You've got to stand up and be counted. And when any Athenian comes to the age of 18, he has to be registered as a citizen. And how do they do that? Who does that? Well, you pitch up at the register office and you bring your dad and you bring maybe an uncle, and they swear on oath that they are your father and your uncle, and therefore, and the mother was this, and we were married there, and the witnesses are these, and then you are registered. So Pericles, none of that can happen for Pericles Jr.
I assume Pericles Jr., he's lost to history. We don't actually know what happened to him.
Well, I'm afraid we do, and this is another tragedy, and it's a sort of, again, irony. Pericles' life, if you look at it from one point of view, how did his marital or non-marital relations go? His wife he divorced amicably, we're told, but the two legitimate children with that wife, they died of the plague from which Pericles himself died in 430, 429. Terrible plague hit Athens. They're at war. People are crowded together in very hot, insanitary conditions. plague is thought to have started somewhere in Africa, North Africa. Probably typhus, we're not absolutely sure, wiped out a third of the Athenian citizen population, and of course others, including slaves. I've not mentioned them yet, but this is a society based on, or with lots and lots of enslaved persons, including, for example, in Pericles' household, doing the washing, as it were, the cooking, the farming in some cases, and all that. So then after Pericles, both himself dies, but he loses his two legitimate sons, Pericles Jr., the illegitimate one, doesn't die of the plague. He's made legitimate by the Athenian people because Pericles, the great Pericles, has no succession to his household. However, as I say, it gets worse. This Pericles Jr., once he's 30, he can qualify for top offices. So he's born in the mid 440s, roughly. So from 415 on, he could be elected to the top office, which is general or admiral. In 406, he was elected to that office. So he's about 40. And he's one of actually 8 generals, admirals, who are deputed to command a very large fleet. We're at the end of this major war with Sparta, and things are not going well. Sparta's developed a decent fleet, but Athens is still just keeping the edge at sea. They win this naval battle. It takes place up towards what we call the Hellespont, the Dardanelles, northeast Aegean. And the problem is that having won the battle, there are a number of crews of warships that cannot be rescued because a fire breaks out among the fleet. The winds are adverse, so that anybody wanting to rescue these crewmen, ordinary Athenian citizens rowing the ships, can't get to them. And several thousands, some people estimate maybe over 20,000. I mean, an awful lot of Athenians die after winning a battle. And there is a section, there's always been a section at Athens of anti-democrats, people who don't like the fact that Athens is a democracy. They think that the elite, people like them, the rich, the well-educated, should rule, and it should be an oligarchy, not, So they take their chance. They say, look, why have we lost all these men? Because of the democracy. And there's a terrific hue and cry, and the 8 generals are put on trial for murder. And 6 of them pitch up. They're at this big assembly meeting, which degenerates. It shouldn't be a court. It's turned into a court very cleverly by the opponents of democracy. And the 6, actually the 8, are condemned collectively, which is illegal, to death. And one of those 8 and one of the 6 who pitched up in that assembly was Pericles Jr. And in those times, the normal penalty, the way in which you execute somebody, you tell them, here is a phial containing hemlock. You drink that and you die. And that's famously the way Socrates dies in 399. But that was the end of Pericles Jr. and the end of Pericles' family line.
That's terribly sad. Although there is one figure who is an adopted member of the family who we can kind of pin on to Pericles, Alcibiades. But he must have been heavily influenced by his adoptive father.
Absolutely, but if you like, in the wrong way, that he rebelled, he reacted. He was the exact antithesis, great Greek word, of Pericles. So Alcibiades, another aristocrat, very distinguished, an ancestor, plays an important role. Battle of Salamis, which is the great victory of the Athenian navy, the Greek navy, but mainly Athenian, against the Persians when they're invading 480, 479. Pericles very keen on being on that same side, the naval emphasis. Famous play by Aeschylus, which Pericles funds the Persians, 472, all about the Battle of Salamis, which is the great Greek and particularly Athenian democratic victory. Anyway, to get on to Alcibiades, in a battle in 447, this is a time when Athens is extremely powerful, throwing its weight around and rather overreaching itself, to be quite honest. Actually, this is a big lesson, I think, that Pericles drew round about that time, round about the time he met and fell for Aspasia. I mean, it's all happening in the early 440s. The Parthenon is...
Yes.
Yeah, that very same year. I'll come on to the Parthenon. But so Alcibiades' dad is killed in this battle, which is a defeat for the Athenians. And because Alcibiades' dad and Pericles were mates, and because there was no other obvious relative of Alcibiades, who was aged 3, who wanted to take him on, Pericles takes him on. So you have a household, it's quite extraordinary. Pericles, Aspasia, Alcibiades. And 20 years or so later, so we're moving on to the 420s, Alcibiades by now, he was born about 450. So in 420, he's 30, so he can be elected to the top job, which is the generalship. He starts throwing his weight around. At the midpoint of the Athenian-Spartan War, first 10 years have been a stalemate and a peace is made. But Alcibiades wants to break that peace, because what glory is there in being the leading statesman or leading politician in a democracy if there's no fighting going on? So what Alcibiades does, he sets out to break up the diplomatic relations between Athens and Sparta, so just get fighting again. And sure enough, he does it. He's very successful. But he, like Pericles, is the subject of a biography by Plutarch. And Alcibiades is there presented as a chameleon, which I think is a brilliant image. That is, if the Athenian people are veering one way, then Alcibiades suddenly, he entirely agrees. That's exactly my point of view. So having tried to, and successfully, broken up the diplomatic relations, he then persuades the Athenian people. I mean, I'm not saying he does it all by himself, but he's so flamboyant and so exciting and so persuasive, but in a very bad way, to undertake a massive expedition, not in the Aegean, so to leave the normal sphere of Athenian naval activity, which is actually crucial for the Athenians to ensure their grain supply from the Black Sea. One reason the Athenians built up a big fleet, what some people call an empire, an alliance, is to ensure that the grain ships that every May, June time came down through the Hellespont into the Aegean could do so safely. They wouldn't be pirated. At any rate, the Athenian fleet is developed to a great extent. And therefore, Alcibiades says, look, guys, we're so powerful. Why waste our time in the Aegean? Or he doesn't put it quite like that, but let's go and invade Sicily. Because you know what? They've got lots more grain there as well. We can get hold of that. And think of the power and the glory. Now, this is exactly what Pericles had said, do not do. Never increase your involvements, your, of course, in this case, possessions. I mean, you just simply got to hang on to what you've got. So, in a way, Alcibiades is the Pericles, ironically, having been fostered within his household. It's like a viper has been bred in the nest of Pericles.
Well, Alcibiades is paired with Coriolanus, but Pericles, and I know you've mentioned Fabius Maximus, having written the biography, if you were to have a crack at creating a new parallel life for Pericles, do you think you would stick with Fabius Maximus, or is there another Roman statesman that you would select?
No, definitely not. No, it would have to be somebody far more august, and it would have to be somebody, I think, probably not of the high Roman, that is Republican period, the 1st century BC, where you've got civil war going on the whole time. It's very difficult to be statesman-like during civil war. In a way, the Roman Republic's last 100 years was just a century of civil war. So I'd want to go back to somebody now. This is the problem. A Democrat who was assassinated. Now, Pericles was exceptionally clever in that he might have been assassinated when he was in his 30s because he supported the politics and the program of a politician, Ephialtes, who was very democratic and who was assassinated. So there was a risk that Pericles might be assassinated. The man I'm thinking of is Gaius Sempronius Gracchus. So he's an aristocrat, but Rome is not a democracy. So we're not comparing like for like. Crassus, this is Gracchus, not Crassus.
Yeah, Crassus.
Yes, there's a Freudian slip. He wished to push Rome far more. In other words, there was a division between, this is a later term, but you've got the populares, people who think the populace of Rome should have more, what should we say, initiative. The Roman formula for the Republic is Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate first, and the Roman people. The division in Gracchus's time, we're in the late 2nd century BC, the 130s, 120s BC. The division is those who think it's great. The Senate, that is the aristocracy, the oligarchy, should rule. And those who say no, the people should have more say, and indeed they shouldn't allow the Senate to pass measures which actually weaken the power of the ordinary people. So Gracchus was one of those. Well, he would be the nearest. However, he wasn't cautious in the way that Pericles was cautious, but he had the same instincts, and he was a man of stature. He wrote political thought, and Pericles didn't, interestingly. We've got no inkling that he actually was an author. There are people, contemporaries of his, and people I think he knew, who wrote political theory, including democratic political theory. There's one called Hippodamus, who came from the same city as Aspasia, Miletus. So I'm pretty sure that Pericles will have known him for various reasons. Well, he was a Democrat, and he wrote political thought, political theory, very progressive, which actually wasn't put into effect because he was too radical, but nevertheless, very, very egalitarian. He was very interested in how people lived. You mustn't just go into the assembly and vote and be equal there. You've got to be equal in the way you live in your local village or your local quarter of a city.
Well, if one takes Pericles' legacy, I guess the most obvious legacy that we live with, we see today, is the building program that I think certainly when I was taught, it was almost called, I think it was called the Periclean building program.
It was. Now, one of my, as I say, you might call me a terrible destructor or whatever, but I tried to take that down a notch. Yes, Pericles.
Disappointing.
Well, he is associated very specifically with one particular bit of the building program. It is the cult statue made of a wooden core with gold and ivory on the outside for the flesh and the decoration. So it's called Chryselephantine, and it's the statue of Athena Parthenos done by Phidias, or Phidias, as the Greeks call him today. And Pericles is specifically said to be one of those who managed, because each item in the building program has its budget. And so each has a committee which registers money coming in, money going out, spent on what. So everything, because it's a democracy, has to be accounted for. And ultimately, the council and the various committees is responsible for checking anybody dealing with public money. So public money now, this is partly controversial. Was it because the Athenians were getting in tribute from their allies against Persia? That was the point of the alliance. And yet they're building in Athens this big building program without consulting. It's not allies, do you approve our building program? No, the Athenian assembly made all the decisions advised by the council. But anyway, that is the one thing that he is specifically in reputable evidence associated with. Obviously, but for him, I mean, he must have been one of those advocating for it. And indeed, when in the late 440s, there is a bit of a head-to-head with a particular politician called Thucydides. This is another Thucydides, not the historian. He's an older man. It comes to an ostracism. Now, one of the peculiarities of the Athenian democracy was every year the assembly is asked at a particular point, do you want to hold an ostracism? Meaning, in a couple of months' time, 6,000 at least Athenians have to pitch up in the agora, which is the civic center beneath the Acropolis, and they have to bring along a potsherd, an ostrakon, with either written on it or scratched on it or painted on it a name. And that's the name of the man you want to see exiled for 10 years, ostracized. That's where that comes from, ostrakismos. And so in 443 BC, there is one of those. The Athenian people decide they're fed up with two politicians going head to head and making life difficult. Let's resolve this issue. One or other of them must go. And they decided, we think by a large majority, that Thucydides should go, not Pericles. But one of the arguments that Thucydides used against Pericles was, we're building the Parthenon, we're building all these other buildings up on the Acropolis, below the Acropolis, and we've waited 30, 40 years because they were destroyed by the Persians, but we've now decided we've got the money. Well, we've gone too far. We're spending far too much. It's a vanity project. And I'm sure he added, the Allies think we're using their money for the glorification of Athens, not for the greater good of Hellas, the Greeks. At any rate, Pericles won that argument hands down. And for the next 14 years on the trot, he was elected, and no one else ever was in the same position before or since, every year elected general. And that, I think, tells you what the Athenian people thought about Pericles and about the building program.
Yeah, and why he was such a significant figure throughout the 5th century.
Absolutely. And as you say, he's gone down, and one of the chapters of my book, right at the end, is a kind of run quite quickly through his legacy as, in terms of people reacting to using him or criticizing him. I mean, the legacy is not by any means unambivalently positive, because democracy of the ancient Greek type was actually thought to be by people in its own time, and many people since, a terrible thing. For example, the Americans, who are about to celebrate 250 years of their, what they call democracy. Any Athenian would have come and said, no, that's an oligarchy. But at any rate, they think, or they thought in the 1770s, that ancient Athenian democracy was just mob rule. I mean, look what they did to Socrates, and so on.
No, but I think ostracism's the one element of their democracy that I would really love to see in ours.
Well, it's one way. I mean, see, we have had a referendum, and it's an equivalent. A plebiscite is the equivalent of a one-off major decision-making on a matter of policy. The Athenians personalized it, routinized it, and made it to that extent much less damaging. It's normal politics. I mean, to a non-democrat or an anti-democrat, it's horrendous that somebody is treated as if they're a criminal. In other words, exile was a very serious punishment, and they might not have done anything criminal. But if the people say they must go, then they are treated as if they're, well, anti-democrats thought that was abhorrent. Aristotle thought that was really dreadful. But my point is it's normal politics, whereas for us, a referendum is not.
No, not at all. Well, Paul, this has been fantastic. Thanks so much for coming on and chatting about Pericles. Listeners, the links are in the show notes for the book. It's a fantastic read, as ever, that you'll get from Paul Cartledge. But Paul, thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, it's always great to talk to you, even if at a distance.
We've come to the end of this club meeting, so thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch about club benefits, please do, either by email or on X or Instagram. Links are in the show notes. I've also included my Substack link so members can read articles I've written on various matters that may be of interest. The History Book Club is written and presented by me, Oliver Webb-Carter. Music is by listener Chat DMZ. Episodes continue next week and every week, so please do join, subscribe, and if you can provide the club with a 5-star rating, we would be delighted. In the meantime, I thank you again, and now I have to usher members out into the real world. Until next time.
I'm not giving up. I am selling the building.
The final season of FX's The Bear.
The restaurant is flooded.
Everything's either going to be okay.
No, stop!
Or not.
We are outgunned and we are outmanned, but we have each other.
FX's The Bear, the final season. All episodes now streaming on Disney+.